Which choice most logically completes the text? Mongolia, which according to international indices has relatively strong democratic institutions and low international income inequality, experienced an inflation rate of 4.3% in 2017, whereas Cameroon, which shows the opposite pattern on such indices, had an inflation rate of only 0.6% that year. So let's take some time to reflect and digest what we have read just now. We have that situation, guys, that Mongolia indeed has better economy and better democracy compared to Cameroon, but has some problems with inflation, and inflation levels are higher for Mongolia. With Cameroon, guys, in terms of economy and democracy, Cameroon is worse than Mongolia. But in terms of inflation, Cameroon is doing a better job than Mongolia is doing. So let's go on with that in mind. Such comparisons have engendered speculation that by diluting control over the economy, democratic institutions inhibit states' ability to contract inflationary pressures. So, in simpler words, it means that, let's look at that sketch once more. It means that better economy and better democracy result in worse inflation, or to be more specific, higher inflation. But higher inflation is something negative. So let's say that it's a worse inflation, right? Sure. Let's go on reading. To test this possibility systematically, Raj Desai examined democratic strengths, international inequality. Keep in mind, guys, that it's international, which means within that country, not international, and inflation in more than 100 countries, finding that democratic strengths, if associated with low inequality, restrains inflationary pressure, suggesting that. So we have to complete that statement, guys. And what the study found? The study found that when we combine good economy with good democracy, we are getting a better job in coping with inflation. It means something like this: better economy and better democracy are going to result in indeed lower inflation, which, as you see, is indeed opposite what the previous study has said. So let's look at the tips before we go on, how we should approach that type of a question. So inference questions, guys, they are indeed considered, this type is indeed considered the hardest type in evidence-based reading and writing, but there are some ways to make it relatively easier, even though practicing is going to be even more difficult. So first one is to identify the focus. So the thing is that, guys, with inferences, even though the passage is really difficult, once you understand it, you'll be able to go with an option uh, straight after reading it. So what's our focus? Our focus is that thing. Our focus is to say that better economy and better democracy result in better inflation, right? In better inflation work, let's say. But indeed, the study said opposite. So we have to say something about the study, probably about the example of Mongolia and Cameroon specifically. Let's read the options. It would be a mistake to treat the relative inflation rates of Mongolia and Cameroon as indicative of an inherent shortcoming in democratic institutions with regard to control over inflation. So what does that mean? Let me decipher it for you. It means that the difference between Mongolia and Cameroon in terms of inflation and economy and in the democracy should not be taken as an ultimate example, and it may be indeed something quite unique, and it may not represent the whole pattern. You cannot generalize it. That's indeed the thing, and it really fits. So we may leave A, and most probably it's the answer. But let's keep reading and eliminate other options. B. Speculations about the relative inability of democratic institutions to counteract inflation are based on measures that tend to exaggerate the levels of inflation in strongly democratic countries such as Mongolia. So, indeed, we are said nothing about the measures that exaggerate the levels of inflation. It's simply not given. That part would be not given because we know nothing about measures that can exaggerate something. As we are not talking about the trends in general, we are talking about specific examples. We are talking about specific example of Mongolia and Cameroon. The factors that contributed to Mongolia's elevated inflation rate relative to Cameroon's have less to do with the country's political institutions than with the country's levels of income inequality. Indeed, it's wrong, guys, because both economy and democracy economy and democracy, they indeed come hand in hand and they cannot be separated. And the passage, it doesn't really says that one of them does it does more job than the other one, so this one would be false, because right here we say so finding that democratic strengths, if associated with low inequality, restrains inflationary pressures, which means that when good democracy and low inequality, which is economy, are combined, it's going to result in better work in terms of inflation. It means that it's going to result in lower inflation, which is good. But it says, C option says that uh, so democracy is doing a better job than economy. It's doing more to restrain that inflation, but indeed it's false. Both of them are important. The difference between Mongolia and Cameroon with regard to democratic institution strengths may have been greater in 2017 than was represented by international indices. So this one, guys, again, not given. And we are not talking about the differences. And yeah, really, it's really not given, guys. Why? That's because we never talked about differences, and generally the focus is really different. So we may put not given for this one and cross it out as well because it's completely off. So yeah, and we are left only with A option, which is the correct one, as it really says that the example of Mongolia and Cameroon should not be taken as the ultimate one, right? And we should not generalize it as for the pattern as a whole. And let's go down for tips, guys. What should we take away? First tip would be to identify the focus. So, what was the focus in our example, guys? The focus was the impact of economy and democracy on inflation. And indeed, we found out that the impact was reverse of what was proposed by the first study. And we actually claimed it in our with our option, with the option we chose, right? So, and the second tip, guys, to come up with answer. That's a really good way of improving your understanding and making sure that you are not just reading for the sake of reading, because it's most of the time the case, guys, that you just read and do not understand and move on with the options. And one more bonus tip I would say is to not look at the options unless you are 100% sure what you have just read. Sure, to not confuse you, I wouldn't say 100%, but at least 80%. Unless you are 80% sure about the thing that you have read, unless you understood it as a whole, you should not look at the answers because there is really much of that not given stuff that can confuse you, and you won't be even able to understand the passage after reading it twice or three times.